It's all right. The way this is set. Welcome, everybody. My name is François Louis. I'm the China art historian here, and have the honor to invite and introduce Sören Stark tonight. Sören has been since 2010 an assistant professor for Central Asian art and archaeology at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University, just across the park. And he specializes in nomadic studies, in nomads in Central and Inner Asia, and has actually already done quite a number of very interesting projects. At ISAW, he curated or co-curated and co-edited a wonderful catalog on nomads and networks, ancient art and culture of Kazakhstan that came out in 2012. And he's also a co-editor of a handbook on Central Asian archaeology that comes out by Oxford University Press. And I hear he's been for several years now, several summers, doing field work in Bukhara, where he's studying forts and fortifications, 4th and 5th century. So he's like widely active, mostly as an archaeologist, but he did study archaeology and art history in Germany at the University of Halle. And it's his area that he started out with, the Türks. We might hear from him perhaps a little bit more clarification on how to pronounce their name. So in I think 2005 he graduated with a dissertation on the Turks in Central Asia, and it's particularly this field that I've been interested in. I've been working on the Liao dynasty and the Khitans, and they picked up in the 10th century quite a lot of administrative structures, but also language from the Turks in Mongolia and all the way to, I guess, western parts of Inner Asia. So, without further ado, I welcome Sören here.
Thank you, François. Thank you for coming. When the title of a presentation starts with between China, Iran, and Byzantium, chances are pretty high that you will hear something about Silk Road. In the general public, as well as in many parts of academia, the Silk Road is perceived as a network of caravan routes connecting east and west, and a multitude of oasis hubs in between, just as on this map from a recent exhibition catalogue of the British Museum. The conventional narrative of these networks is dominated by the almost iconic image of the merchant caravans marching through the deserts, transporting silk and other precious commodities between China and the Mediterranean. And it is this image that is now reenacted on a large scale by modern tourists all the way between Samarkand and Dunhuang. But merchants and camels are, of course, only one aspect of this exchange network, and the extremely wealthy trading firms in Samarkand and Bukhara or elsewhere were certainly not the only agents of exchange, whether commercially or culturally. Now, this image comes probably less frequently to mind in anticipation of a discussion of transcultural exchange and transfer. And why should it? Do these vast and seemingly empty steplands not appear to us like the exact countervision of the bustling, cosmopolitan, urban centers strung along the Silk Road, like the one imagined in this fanciful reconstruction? Well, it is precisely this seemingly peripheral landscape of the inner Eurasian steppes that was the stage for the surprising political career of a tribal group of pastoral nomads that resulted in the political unification of vast stretches of the Eurasian continent. And it was this unification that initiated what many scholars have called the golden age of the Silk Road. And with this I come to the actual protagonists of my presentation, the early Central Asian Turks. One word first, as demanded by François, on terminology. With Turks I mean in the following: a particular political, to some extent tribally organized group of pastoral nomads in Central Eurasia that ruled over large stretches of Central Eurasia from the middle of the 6th to the middle of the 8th centuries, and not the inhabitants of present-day Turkey. In fact, it were these Turks in Inner Eurasia who were the first to carry this ethnonym, Turks, Türk. And it was their rise to imperial power that spread this ethnonym far and wide across the Eurasian continent and through the ages. Now, these Turks formed as a political group in a complex and still not very well understood ethnogenetic process in somewhere in the southern Altai mountains, in southern Siberia, at some point in the late 5th, early 6th century. Supposedly, they, or at least their leading clan, lived there as iron miners and as blacksmiths, serving the then masters of the eastern Eurasian steppes, the Ruran or the Asian Avars. They probably called themselves Avars, and it's from them that this ethnonym later spread all the way into Eastern Europe with the European Avars. And it was only in around 550 that these Turks revolted against their overlords, and in just about 20 years they came to rule most parts of the Eurasian steppes, and dominating, or at least competing with, a multitude of agrarian-based polities in their neighborhood, from the northern Chinese borderlands to the Hindu Kush, the Caucasus, all the way to the northern Black Sea area. By around 570, the northern Chinese dynasties were tributary, as was Sasanian Iran, and in the west they drove Byzantium from Crimea. And this led, of course, to very intensive diplomatic ties across the Eurasian continent. Byzantine and Persian embassies traveled as far as to the Tian Shan, if not even to central Mongolia, and Turkic rulers married again and again Chinese, Persian and Central Asian princesses. So in many ways this picture is quite reminiscent of that of the Mongol Empire, the Mongol World Empire, some 700 years later. Now, the role that the Mongol imperial elites of the 13th century played in fostering intensive encounters and exchanges on a Eurasian scale is relatively well studied and relatively well known to us. For the Turks in the 6th and 7th centuries, this picture is much less clear. The academic discussion has been mainly focused on the role of the imperial elites of the Turks as patrons of merchants, predominantly of Sogdian merchants, but much less studied is the role that these elites played themselves in fostering cultural communication, transmission and appropriation. And it is this aspect I want to have a closer look at today. In particular, I'm interested in how the consumption of imported luxuries by the elites of the nomadic Turks impacted and shaped their self-representation, and how this then in turn led to the circulation of motifs across Eurasia. Well, obviously, cultural transmission from one culture to the other is never a matter of random copying, but an act of more or less active appropriation. It always implies a deliberate selection of those foreign features and traits that, for one reason or the other, resonate with notions, with conceptions, with experiences of those who appropriate them. In the visual sphere, such borrowings were often iconographically somewhat adapted to the new ecological and social environment. One of the key media for this kind of cultural appropriation are, especially in the elite sphere, imported luxuries. Now, if we speak of imported luxuries in this Turk context, we speak in fact about necessities in the political culture related to nomadic statehood, be it Turks, be it Mongols, Huns, or others. It has something to do with the character of state formation in the Eurasian steppes, which is closely bound to the military sphere, which in turn is largely characterized by personal retinues, by patron-client relationships between sovereign and members of the elite, and by the importance of distributing booty in the broadest sense, for instance during feasting. And all this is also true for the empire of the Turks. That means that the expansion and continued existence of this polity of the Turks depended to a significant degree on the individual success of their rulers, their imperial elites, to extract such prestige goods from outside via trade, plunder, tribute, and all kind of diplomatic exchanges, and also on the successful redistribution of these commodities among followers and allies. So the ideal ruler in the steppe is, on the one hand, of course, the successful commander who acquires great wealth, but then also the one who generously distributes it among his followers, not the one who hoards them and displays them only. Thus, and this is meant to be sort of a schematic view, none of these things actually went to the any of the camp residences, but this is just to show the principle. At the various camp residences of the Turks in central Mongolia, in the steppe lands north of the Tian Shan mountains, commodities from all over Eurasia were consumed, displayed, and then redistributed. And this pertained, of course, to a wide spectrum of objects. Of special importance were, of course, textiles, particularly textiles, silk textiles from China, and indeed Chinese silks have been found quite regularly in Turkic burials in Mongolia and in southern Siberia. Or we know of precious silk textiles in a more indirect way, because they are sometimes depicted on Turk period stone statues that were found in Mongolia, in southern Siberia, and in the Central Asian steppes. But China was only one source for handicraft items of foreign origin. Another important region for such imports, and from where the Turks imported luxuries, must have been the various oasis principalities between eastern Iran and Gansu, where the Turks ruled as overlords. An important role was, in this context, again played by textiles, but also metalware from these areas was apparently highly valued by the elites of the Turk, and an important motor for the flow of these commodities was a very extensive fur and horse trade. But luxury goods of all kinds reached the Turkic residences also by way of tributes and regular taxes. We know that the Turks systematically extracted taxes from all these principalities in Sogdiana, in Turkmenistan, and in the Tarim Basin. And even from the far west, from Byzantium, luxuries and even pieces of figurative art have reached the residences of the Turks. In the 60s and 70s of the 6th century, Constantinople sent frequently embassies to the Turkic courts, and in the 20s of the 7th century, there were even plans to marry the daughter of the Emperor Heraclius, here depicted together with her brother on a Byzantine silver coin, with a Turk Kagan, with the supreme ruler of the Turks. And we know from the 8th, early 9th century author Nikephoros, a Byzantine author, that in preparation for this marriage, the Kagan received not only precious tableware, imperial garments and jewelry, but also a portrait of the emperor's daughter, and I really hope that it looked a bit better than the one here on this coin. Of course, such precious personal items very rarely reappear in archaeological contexts. But two such rare examples might be these two Sasanian extraordinary gold vessels from the famous hoard, so-called hoard, it's actually a burial, from Madaya Pereshepina in present-day Ukraine. These two vessels are made of almost 5 kilograms of solid gold. And with this they were far too valuable to be used in ordinary trading transactions. Just to give you an idea on the basis of prices in Central Asia from the early 8th century, so slightly later, but still more or less valid, also for a century before, 5 kilograms of gold amounted to something between 22 and 24,000 drachms. And with such an amount one could buy between 110, 112 adult male slaves of the most expensive category, or circa 2,000 cows. So instead, and that's just too much to be traded on a day-to-day basis. Instead, it has been suggested by the late Boris Marchak that these two vessels were once part of a very substantial war booty, or more precisely that they originated directly from the Sasanian royal treasury in Ctesiphon, the capital, and that they formed part of those substantial gifts by which the Sasanian brought peace from the Western Turks in 628. But taxes, tributes, diplomatic gifts, plunder were not the only means by which the elites of the Turks got into the possession of prestigious, luxurious commodities. We know that goldsmiths and armorers in Turfan and in the southern Caucasus specifically worked on their orders. Perhaps the Turks already deported or attracted foreign specialists into the steppes, as the Mongols did later on a grand, also Eurasian scale. But so far we have no definite evidence for this, and unfortunately archaeological data are often very ambiguous with regard to this particular question, where a particular workshop or craftsman worked. To give you an illustration of this problem, in a Turkic period burial of a member of the local elite of the Turks in the now Russian Altai, archaeologists found a precious sword, a palash, and you see that along the plate of this palash runs a Sogdian inscription set in gold damascene, has been read. It mentions a certain Kadgun as the owner of the sword. It's probably the original Turkic owner of the sword. And because of the Sogdian inscription, it has been assumed that it was a Sogdian master who produced this sword for a member of the local Turkic elite. But we don't, in fact, not know whether that happened in mainland Sogdiana or in one of the many Sogdian colonies between Sogdiana and northern China, or actually in the steppes in the Altai. But regardless of whether foreign masters worked actually at the camps of the Turkic elites or not, these camps were surely real melting pots where objects from all over Eurasia were accumulated, consumed and redistributed. Now, the interesting question now for me is how this exposure to foreign prestige goods and luxuries and their alien iconographies might have shaped the Turkic elite's own representation, and how this might have been used by the Turks to create their own iconographies of power. Let's first have a look at an important monument from central Mongolia to approach this question, and that is the memorial site of Bugut, erected for one of their early Khagans. The most remarkable find from this site is a stele, you see that here on the screen, worked in local sandstone. Now, upon closer inspection, we can see that it is standing on a turtle basis, whilst on its top we see the depiction of two intertwined dragons. And these are both features, of course, very well known from Chinese funeral and commemorative steles since the late Eastern Han period. Now, interestingly, the Turks did not simply copy the Chinese model. They altered it, they adapted it. Instead of the Chinese commemorative inscription that we would expect, the stele features an inscription in Sogdian. You see that here, enlarged. And on the back side, another inscription in Brahmi script that has not been read so far, so we don't know in which language it was written. The use of, and it is from this Sogdian inscription that we know about for whom the stele was erected and when it was erected. Now, the use of Sogdian language and Brahmi alphabet points to the role played by people from the Oasis Belt, south of the steppes, as cultural brokers in the steppes. Obviously, they also provided models and ideas from which the Turkic elite could draw for the formulation of their own symbols of legitimate rule. And we see this influence from this direction even clearer on a monument from the western heartland of the Turkic steppes, in the steppes north of the Tian Shan in present-day Xinjiang, namely on a statue from a very similar memorial site at the site called Mongol Küre, a memorial very similar to the one in Bugut, dating roughly to around 600 CE, so slightly later than Bugut. This statue also depicts, a Western Turk Khagan, identified by the inscription. It's also a Sogdian inscription, but this time it's not only the use of a Sogdian inscription, which points to the oasis cultures south of the steppe, but the iconography of the statue itself. One element is the very peculiar headdress that this fellow is wearing, which has parallels in Sogdian terracottas and wall paintings from Kucha and elsewhere. But what is particularly remarkable is that the statue actually depicts the motive of the princely banqueter. This motive is well known from the visual art in Sogdiana, in Turkmenistan, and it can also be found in depictions of Sogdians on their funeral monuments in northern China. Most interesting is, however, that this particular pose of holding a vessel while banqueting appears on a series of Heftelight drums, so it is apparently clearly linked to royal iconography in the region. And I wonder whether the Turks actually really adopted the motive for their own royal iconography from the Heftelites, because the Heftelites were their political predecessors in the western heartland of the Turk Empire. But this is by far not all. The Turks also borrowed symbols of power from the Sasanians, their competitors in the southwest. An interesting example for this is provided by a series of copper coins found in recent years in the area of Tashkent, not far away from the residence of the Western Turks. They show on the obverse a ruler seated, hope you can discern that, on what seems to be a typical Iranian taht with zoomorphic supports, perhaps some kinds of birds, maybe an eagle, or bird-like creatures, be also griffins. And indeed we know from the report of a Byzantine envoy to the ruler of the Western Turks that the ruler of the Turks used to sit on, I've highlighted that here for you, quote, on a couch of beaten gold, which was supported by 4 golden peacocks, end of quote. So, and thrones supported by animals, often in the form of protomes, are of course widely known from the Iranian world. I could show you many examples, but the animal throne is not the only foreign element borrowed for the representation of this Turk ruler here on the obverse of a coin, because hovering behind him we can clearly see a Nike. Now that sounds Roman, Greek, Byzantine at the beginning, but for the period under consideration here, the 7th century, this was of course also a very well-known element of the Sasanian imperial iconography. But these borrowings didn't stop here. Even from the Roman, late Roman, Byzantine imperial iconography, we see the Turks drawing for their own symbols of royal power. Obviously, this ruler over Tashkent used in another series of coins dating to the same period prototypes of Byzantine coinage for his own coinage. Now, the interesting question is, why did he do that? Byzantine coins were, we know that, a fairly rare phenomenon in Transoxania and in the wider region. And the region had coinage of its own since many centuries. So it was not an issue of sort of rendering credibility to coinage as such. So why then? I think the explanation comes from the grand diplomatic arena of this period. There's clear written evidence that Byzantine solidi reached the Western Turks as diplomatic gifts in the context of the Western Turk-Byzantine alliances in the 560s and then again in the 620s. And we know that Turk rulers reused or imitated these Byzantine coins for their own diplomatic correspondence by attaching them to their own diplomatic letters. So obviously these coins or their imitations functioned as a kind of diplomatic calling card for the Turks in their own diplomatic exchanges, indicating perhaps to the exceptional, the imperial status of the sender of these letters. On the one hand, this was probably due to the fact that they were made of gold, which was exceptional for coins in the Middle East and also in the Far East. But on the other hand, it must have been also the specifically Roman imagery that lent this exceptional status to those who used it. And this was not only true for the image of the Emperor of Rome that you see here on otherwise fairly locally circulating coinages, but for yet another motive that was particularly closely tied to the foundation myth of Rome. And I mean, of course, the Lupa Romana motive, which is known from a whole series of bracteates, of medallions, and even from wall paintings in Central Asia. Now, the exact reason why this particular motive was so popular in Western Central Asia is not known to us, and we should be probably careful not to rush into conclusions. Most likely, the original significance of the motive was largely unknown to the beholder in Western Central Asia. But it is probably too easy, as it has been done, to assume that the wolf suckling human infants was just an exotic motive without any association with the Roman Empire. I mean, for this, too obvious are the attempts to create a particular Western air in this imagery, for instance, with the help of westernizing busts, depicting busts as here seen on the medallion, or imitations of westernizing but not legible legends. Most likely the motive resonated with a whole bundle of local Central Asian concepts and ideas which were connected with a kind of a specific topos of the far west. Unfortunately, our knowledge of such ideas in Central Asia in pre-Islamic times is way too incomplete to reach any substantial conclusion on that. But by way of a hypothesis, I wonder if the popularity of a motive so intrinsically connected with the big empire of the far west, and as it must have been perceived, was connected with a particular world concept popular in Central Asia at this time, namely the concept of the four quarters of the world, each ruled by a king disposing of the particular resources of his kingdom. So in the east there's the king of men. This kingdom is associated with wisdom. In the south besides the king of elephants, in the north there's the king of horses, and this kingdom is associated particularly with warlikeness, and over the ruler of the west, or over the kingdom of the west, rules the king of treasures. So one of the tropes connected with the west, current in Central Asia, was wealth and abundance. And from the perspective of Central Asia, this kingdom of treasures was often, not only, but often associated with Rome or Byzantium. And perhaps it was this notion that was associated with the Lupa Romana motive in Central Asia. However that may be, we are confronted with a stunningly wide range of origins for visual symbols employed by the early Turks, the 6th, 7th centuries, to express imperial status and to communicate legitimate rule to their subjects and to the audiences of these monuments. But how does this all work together? Well, it is only since very recently that fresh archaeological evidence from central Mongolia enables us to better understand how these very diverse elements, I've shown you pictures on stele, on coins, on bracteates, metalwork, how this all works together and is combined in one single material assemblage. And this is this spectrum, and the final part of my presentation will deal with this fresh evidence, namely an elite tomb discovered by a Mongol Kazakh team in summer 2011 in central northern Mongolia at a site called Sören Bumbaga. It is still not completely published, so the following remarks are of a preliminary character, and I have to apologize for the somewhat poor quality of some of the following images. That is what is available to me at the moment. Now, what kind of tomb is that? The tomb is marked on the surface by a tumulus, rather typical, and it actually seems to be part of a whole group of tombs, as 7 more such tumuli are visible on the surface nearby. They have not been excavated as of yet. But it gets interesting when we look what goes on below this tumulus. So below the tumulus appeared a tomb architecture well known from Chinese elite tombs from the south. From the south, entry is provided by a tromus with 4 vertical air shafts ending in 2 side niches and ending in a square tomb chamber. The tomb was lavishly decorated with murals. The wall of the tromus show, for instance, depictions of a dragon and a tiger, procession scenes, banners, saddled horses with grooms, lotus flowers, demon masks, gate buildings. You see a selection of these here on the screen. Those of the burial chamber feature male and female persons seated under trees. The style of these murals is rather provincial, as you can see, but the content is perfectly well known from Tang period tomb murals. This observation is complemented by circa 100 terracotta figurines from the inventory of the tomb, such as mounted musicians, guardian figurines, and fantastic beasts. The tomb has unfortunately no epitaph, so dating remains somewhat problematic, but as recently pointed out by the Japanese scholar Ushio Asuma, the architecture and the murals of the Sören Bumbaga tomb find particularly close parallels in Tang tombs from around 670, and such a dating is also confirmed, or further strengthened, I should say, by other objects from the tomb inventory. For instance, several specimens of gilded fittings of a horse bridle from Kurgan 29 at a cemetery in southern Siberia in the Russian Altai, with which has yielded radiocarbon dates of the second half of the 7th century, and there are gilded fittings in the tomb in Sören Bumbaga which are typologically very, very close to this otherwise not very popular type of metal fittings for horse bridles. A dating of around 670 would place the complex into the period when between 646 and 682 the central Mongolian steppes were part of the so-called loose bridle administrative system of the Tang. That means they officially invested various regional TLA nomadic leaders as area commanders and prefects. And such a scenario would of course well account for what is essentially an exact copy of a mid-Tang elite tomb, including its decoration. Further support for this comes from the nearby tomb at a site called Sören, where a few years earlier, in 2009, a Russian Mongolian team excavated a very similar tomb, but without wall paintings and without this kind of rich inventory, about which I will speak in a second a little bit more in detail, but which yielded a tomb epitaph. And this tomb epitaph mentions the tomb owner, and it was indeed such a local leader loyal to the Tang, namely a leader of the Pugu tribe. Perhaps the Sören Bumbagar tomb belonged to another member of this Pugu elite, which is part of the wider Turkic elite stratum of the period. Other features clearly link the tomb owner with this elite stratum of the Turkic steppes, such as the remains of a cremation burial in the tomb, which was the usual burial practice for members of high aristocrats of the Turkic world during the 6th and 7th centuries. Now, of particular interest are several dozens of gold coins and bracteates found in association with the remains of this cremation burial, and this is actually the largest assemblage of such coin or coin-like material ever found in the inner Eurasian steppes. Let's look at this a little bit closer. One specimen, the one in the top of the picture from Sören Bumbagar, is actually an original Heraklius or Heraklius Constantine numisma. 3 more are imitations of Byzantine numismata. And I show you the example, and one example here, it's an imitation of a Phocas coin. At least 12, and I show you 2 specimens, are golden bracteates on the basis of imitations of Byzantine coins. And at least 10 specimens are golden bracteates on the basis of the reverse of Sasanian drachms. Now the remaining specimens of bracteates or imitation coins are more removed or almost entirely independent from Byzantine Western prototypes. They seem to be based on or represent Sogdian or Bactrian issues. However, they also show a distinctly classicizing air, which makes them the most interesting group for the context of our discussion. And that requires us to have a closer look at that. This group subdivides into 2 types of golden bracteates and 1 golden imitation coin. So not a real one, but coin-line objects with a reverse and an obverse, one would call it a coin imitation. The first type of bracteates, represented by at least 4 specimens, shows, you can see, a bearded male bust in profile with a pseudo-legend, perhaps imitating Latin or Greek script. The second type of bracteates, represented by only a single specimen, features a bust, this time in 3/4 view, ultimately also derived from Anastasius or early Justinian prototypes, but more removed, and now carrying actually a elaborated winged crown. And to the left of the portrait appears a Greek cross. Most interesting is finally this imitation coin, likewise represented by a single specimen only. It features on the obverse a three-quarter bust, which is also derived from a distant Anastasius or Justinian prototype, but this time more elaborately executed and embellished with several additional iconographical details, also accompanied by a Latin or Greek pseudo-legend. The bust is wearing a peculiar headgear composed of a pearled diadem with 5 pointed lobes and a pearled hood above them, together with 2 pairs of floating ribbons, or with very strange headgear, but a surprisingly close comparison for this really unusual headgear comes from the depiction of royal personages, don't know exactly whom they depict, in a narrative circle of 6th century wall paintings from the main building of Temple 2 at Penchikent in Sogdiana. Now, what is, in view of our discussion, most remarkable about this imitation coin and the 2 Praktia types is their skillful employment of features that must have lent to them a clear sort of Roman touch, at least in the eyes of a beholder in the faraway eastern steppes. This was achieved by stylistic means, such as the three-quarter profile, or the three-quarter view, or the profile view of some of the portraits, or by the employment of specific iconographic details. Perhaps the most curious one is the rider motif on the ornate of the obverse portrait of the imitation coin, which of course originates from the emperor's shield on 6th century Byzantine coins. This goes also for the cross on the cross on steps on the reverse, which together with the pseudo legend renders basically this reverse into an imitation of a reverse of a Byzantine numisma, or the employment of a cross next to the portrait in the Praktia type 2. Also, the bearded male bust in profile from Praktia type 1 conveys this decisively classicizing flair. It can be in fact compared to 2 silver medallions, one of them gilded, found in an early 8th century layer at Temple 2 at Penchikent, and similar tondi appear wildly on 5th to 7th century metalware from Tukharistan, from Sogdiana, and from the Indo-Iranian borderlands. Now, for a beholder in the inner Asian steppes, all these fantasy portraits with their various additions and combinations might well have been perceived as images of the Roman Caesar, even if the actual portraiture was accompanied by realia of, let's say, Sogdian origin, like the winged crown. It seems as if in the steppes this imagery, this Roman-style imagery, signaled supreme social and political status ever since the Western Turks reused it in signaling their imperial status in their own diplomatic exchanges. At the same time, the conceptual identification of the big realm in the West with the kingdom of treasures made, particularly in funerary contexts, allusions to Rome a very popular way to highlight the wealth and the prosperity of the deceased. Taken together, these elements, individual elements of burial, of the burial assemblage from Sören Bumbagar, offer us a perplexing insights into the sophistication with which objects, practices, and iconographical elements of a very diverse cultural background were combined, reinterpreted in 6th, 7th century elite representation in the inner Asian steppes. As an additional motor for the dissemination, appropriation, and adaptation of artistic traditions over large parts of the old world, this aspect is still largely neglected in the traditional Silk Road narrative of trans-Eurasian exchanges and encounters. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Well, thank you very much, Sören, for your wonderful talk. We have time for questions.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. Can you say something about the imitation coins in terms of the use? Because it seems from the manner of fabrication that they were mass-produced or relatively produced in large numbers.
Yes.
And so were they used, in which way do you think they were used?
Well, I think we have to make we have to differentiate between these Praktiarts and what I call an imitation coin. The Praktiarts are certainly mass-produced, and we see it even in this particular assemblage that usually one type comes with several specimens, is represented by several specimens. Some of them actually might have been sewn on garments. Several of them show holes. We know from burials across the trading routes in the Tarim Bays and all the way into China that actually real Byzantine, Eastern Roman coins as well as imitations of coins have been placed on the mouth of persons buried. Similar to this obulus custom in ancient Greek, and there's a long discussion about this particular costume. Here we are dealing with a cremation burial, so we don't really exactly know what the context was, and the problem is a little bit that we dispose really only, or I dispose only of this picture here about the actual finding, what seems to be the actual finding context for at least some of these Praktiarts and imitation coins in the tomb of Sören Bumbagar. So we don't really know for sure what the actual...
But I mean, they were made with a press, right? They
Yes.
were pressed. So somebody was making a mold with the image of the imitation coin, right?
The Praktiart, yeah.
So to assume that they were made only for jewelry or decorative purpose will be kind of wrong, no? Because if you make a mold for something and you put it in a press, we can assume a few dozens or if not a few hundreds of these imitation coins produced, right?
Well, this imitation coin here that I have discussed extensively, that is not pressed cheaply. It is coined like a real coin, and it is not. I don't think that it is sort of mass-produced because it's absolutely singular. We don't have anything comparable like this.
So how do you think it was made? I'm sorry.
Well, I think it was made as an imitation coin, not to be circulated as coinages, but I think specifically produced. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the tomb, the spectacular tomb that you showed. Is it visitable? And if so, where is it actually located now?
I've never been there. It is in central northern Mongolia, so a little bit in the middle of nowhere. It's not close to any. I think it's about 200 kilometers west of the capital. That is about the. But I think I have the precise coordinates somewhere.
All right, thank you.
And I think it is visible on the ground, but the wall paintings have been taken off, and they are now on display in a local museum at Kharkhorin in near Karakorum, the Mongol capital.
Actually, most of the items that we have seen comes from which museum?
They come from various museums and collections. So, yeah, from all over. A lot comes from the Hermitage
That's what
in Russia. These golden vessels, for instance, because Central Asian metalware has been found mostly in Siberia, actually. But many other objects come from European, American collections.
And historically, how do the Seljuks will come after all of this? How are they related?
Yes, that is a later dynasty of Turkic stock that spoke a Turkic language, the Oghuz Turkic language, and they rise to power only in the 11th century.
Yes, so that they come after.
They come after, yes. They are not directly related with these early Central Asian Turks that built this empire across the steppes.
They are still Turkish.
They are another branch.
They are still of Turkic.
Yes, they originate from within this huge pool of tribes and peoples in the steppelands of Central Eurasia.
Thank you.
Is the inclusion of the cross on those imitation coins or anything about the tombs themselves speak to the religious beliefs of these people? Would we identify them as Christian or something else?
I don't think so, because if we look at this whole assemblage of coins or coin imitations or prakti-arts from only this particular tomb, we see that there are not only symbols harking or that are connected with Christianity present, but also here these prakti-arts that are based on reverse imagery from reverses of Sasanian coins, and more specifically of drachms of Khosrow II. Three of these prakti-arts can be identified stamped on the basis of a reverse of Khosrow minted in the year 30 in Fustat. We can say that. And what you see here is probably not easily discernible, is actually a depiction of a fire altar with two attendants. So Zoroastrian religious iconography.
Say that.
Zoroastrian.
No, you said a depiction of what?
A fire altar. It's a fire altar flanked by two attendants with the bosom bundle. It's a little bit crude here on that, but you see it. You see it right here on the top of an original reverse of a drachm of Khosrow II. So there are also Zoroastrian religious elements in the tomb. I don't think that they really had in mind to show any kind of Christian belief. They wanted to mark these coins as coming from the West, from the lands where the Christian ruled.
And is there anything in the tomb, to this particular tomb or other tombs that have been excavated, that speaks to their individual religious beliefs? Would we identify them would we put them in some category?
No.
Okay.
Yes, John.
Well, I can just say, based on northern Chinese models, this is all very typical in terms of construction and contents of what you would find in contemporary northern China. The one unusual element that might be related to religion is the cremation. And in your diagram of the tomb, what I didn't see was a platform, a coffin platform.
No.
So that is one deviation from the norm, lack of coffin platform and cremation. So I don't know what these reports say about the cremation or perhaps presence of animal bones, which would be more typical of the steppe and steppe beliefs. I know the reports are not very good. Did you see anything more about that?
Yeah, I'm actually really particularly interested in the cremation burial because, and that is absolutely correct. This is an untypical feature when we compare it with the Chinese material. And on the other hand, it's actually what we would expect in a high aristocratic milieu in the steppes. The problem is that we have textual evidence that the Turkic elites buried their deads by cremating them. That is information from Chinese chronicles. Problems we don't have them archaeologically. This is the first time actually that we have something, because usually, well, the cremation burials they have not been found. But we have the Turkic burials that we know. They are inhumation and they are not elite, or they are local elite. They are somewhat different. So yeah, that's true. That is exceptional, and that links to the elite culture of the steppe.
So this tomb is unique also in its Chinese look?
No, there's this other one that was excavated 2009, Shogun, very, very close, 20 kilometers, something like that, close by, which had this, which yielded an epitaph. But apart from that, well, we have more Chinese-looking things in the Uyghur, later in the Uyghur period, but not for the 7th century. That's unique so far.
I have another question about the coins. Do we have a sense who made these coins? I was wondering whether they could have been made in Sogdiana.
Yeah, I was also thinking that they probably, in Sogdiana all this imagery would have been readily available. And that would also kind of explain why some of the more interesting products that are a little bit tuned sort of feature like Sogdian or Western Central Asian features, like a winged crown, things like this. I was also wondering whether they were actually produced in Sogdiana. And then, what is actually quite interesting, except for, of course, one, and then it's this one original coin of Heraclius. And this is actually quite interesting because it can be related to the production of a specific mint and of a specific period, and it must have been minted in Constantinople between 625 and 27, and that is exactly when there was this military alliance between Turks and the Byzantines, and it could well have been that this coin, which was obviously circulating in the steppes for a long time, because at some point it was used as jewelry already, came into the steppes in the course of this alliance. But the other objects, they could have been actually really manufactured in Sogdiana, but it's difficult to prove.
Thank you. The focus, the imitation focus of the Roman Emperor focus, because is that a column?
It's a cross.
It's a what?
A cross.
Oh, I see.
It's a cross on the step platform.
Yeah, I see. No, because from here I don't see well. It looks like a column, and interesting in the Roman, in Rome, in the Forum, the Roman Forum, for focus there is a column.
Yes.
So that's why I was a little confused.
But we see something similar also, a similar motif here on the Heraclius coin. It's typically like Byzantine reverse iconography.
Nice. One question. I was surprised to see a lot of writing in Sogdian and none of the writing in Turkey.
Yeah, but this is actually quite interesting, because I didn't speak about the 8th century. In the 8th century things are completely different. This polity the Ashinatra quality comes to a close in various steps by the middle of the 7th century. Then there's this period of Han Chinese dominance over large areas that were formerly subordinated to the Turks. And then they make a return to power in the late 7th century until the middle of the 8th century. And their memorial monuments, funeral monuments in central Mongolia, they became emblematic for how we understand Turkic elite culture. But in fact, and this is when we have Turkic runic inscriptions appearing there, very Chinese style memorials, some of them actually constructed by Chinese imperial workshops, we know that. But this is a time when the polity of the Turks was much reduced and apparently already in sort of final decline, and was much more focused on dialogue with the powerful neighbor in the south, the Chinese. And we don't see this reaching out to a wider and more diverse audience that we see here with the early Turk Empire. That is the interesting aspect, I think. That in the early decades of Turk rule, in the second half of the 6th century, first half of the 7th century, they tried to speak to more diverse audience. And this is really an imperial kind of strategy, while the late Eastern Turks in Mongolia, they were more focused on speaking to and with the Chinese, from where they get the alimentation to exist. Yes.
I'm still trying to figure out who these Turkic people are.
Me too.
But you're much further along in that exploration. They're not Chinese. They're not Mongolian. I mean,
okay, there are several layers of answers to this question. Linguistically, it seems that most of the people that were sort of tied and were at the elite level of this polity spoke a Turkic language, which is a part of the Altaian language family. But culturally, it's very difficult to distinguish them from tribes that spoke maybe a Proto-Mongolian language, or even some Indo-European languages that might still have been around in the area around this year. It's the typical early medieval material culture of pastoral nomads that is characteristic for the culture of these nomads. And linguistically, they spoke apparently Turkic languages. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
and where does that language begin? Where does that language have its origins?
But the earliest evidence really that we have is from the 8th century only, with these runic inscriptions.
Okay.
In the 8th century, these Turks, people who called themselves Turk, they created an alphabet, probably on the basis of Aramaic type scriptures. Look very runic, very similar to the Scandinavian runes, which apparently was specifically created to feature on memorial and monumental inscriptions hammered in stone. And they have been deciphered, and they turned out to be the oldest documented Turkic languages, very closely related still to the language of the Uyghurs in present-day Xinjiang.
And where does
Older, we don't have older. We don't have written. I mean, we don't have texts from the steppes before that. That's the oldest sort of substantial corpus of texts from the steppes. Before that, we are reliant entirely on information from outside, and information on language of these faraway people is very sparse, sort of vague, and we have names and titles mostly, but what does a name say about the language a person speaks?
And the word Turk comes from?
The name Turk is associated with this ruling group of this empire, who used a Turkic language in the 8th century when they created the inscriptions. I don't want to complicate things because the word Turk is probably not Turkic in origin, but actually the ruling clan of these Turks probably did not speak a ruling language. Did not speak a Turkic language, because all the names and titles that we have of the early rulers of the Turk are actually Iranian. But that's a very debated.
So present-day Turkmenistan,
Yeah.
is it close? I mean, what's the proximity? I'm just trying to like put all of these disparate parts
It is
together.
the ethnonym of the Turks is named Türk, which has something to do with strength. That got very widespread all over the place. In part because of the political prestige of these guys. So people started to call themselves Turks, to be connected with them. That is a very typical process of state formation and ethnogenesis in the steppes. Like later, a lot of people got calling themselves Mongols in the time of the Mongol World Empire. So also in the 6th century, a lot of tribes, kin groups of various sorts started to call themselves Turks because they wanted to connect, or they were called Turks by others, by outsiders, because they look culturally very similar, and because of the prestige, the political prestige of this particular state formation and the imperial status, also later polities, later people tried to connect themselves, and that is what brought this ethnonym Turks all the way to Europe with the Ottomans, you know, and also outsiders used the name Turk in the Middle Ages as a kind of generic term for all kind of nomads in the steppes. Like the Greeks had used the term Scythian, the Romans has used the term Huns, or as Europeans used the term Mongols later in the Middle Ages. So Arabic language sources speak of the Turks, and they mean all these nomads that live beyond the world of Islam in the steppes. There are two aspects to it: the generic quality that the term takes, and then also the specific significance of having a political prestige. It's a prestige name. It's very often the case that these kind of prestige names wander and grew big over time and pop up in certain areas, sometimes over centuries, like with the case of the Avars that I mentioned at the beginning. There's these Avars somewhere in Mongolia, and then 100 years later they appear in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, and it's apparently the same name. It's not clear whether it's the same people, probably not, but the name gets around.
I'm curious again about focus. And now that I know there is a cross, was it because, if I remember, Focus was the one that saved the temple from being destroyed and made it into a Christian church?
I'm not sure whether it was Focus, but there might be.
Yes, I think that because you see putting together why Focus and the cross.
Yes, but all other coins, look here, Heraclius, also
but Focus, the emperor, why would he be there? Otherwise.
No, all Byzantine solidi of the period have this type of reverse.
Sören, that's the standard reverse.
Yes.
That's the standard reverse. So the face on the front.
No, but I'm curious why they chose Focus, the emperor.
Was he the usurper? Was Focus the usurper?
Yes.
Yeah, he was the usurper, right?
Well, let me thank Sören again for this wonderful talk. We're here for a few more minutes. If you have questions, feel free to come up here.
Yeah.